During the summer, I love to live in skirts, and knit fabric makes a light and airy skirt, and making it in the shape of a pencil skirt is actually very easy, very simple, and we're going to learn how to do that today. So the first thing that you need to do before you make your pencil skirt is you need to take your measurements. So we're going to take these three measurements. We're going to take the waist, your hips, and we also want to take the length where it's going to sit. I would like mine just below the knee. So when you're measuring yourself, the waist is the smallest part of you. Your hips is the biggest part of you, around the biggest part of your bum included. And the length, I am just going to hold my measuring tape where I would like it to sit on my waist. I don't like to wear things around the smallest part of my waist. I like it to sit a little bit lower, so that's where I'm going to start my measurement. And I'm just going to let the tape hang to the floor, and then I can kind of look down and find out where my measurement is. So my measurements, don't tell anyone, are 29 for my waist, 37 for my hips, and the length where I would like it is a measly 23 because I'm short. So these are our measurements. Now for the length, we have to add a waistband, so we need a little bit of seam allowance in order to sew the waistband on. So we are going to add an inch for seam allowance on the top, and we also need to make a hem. So we're going to add another inch on the bottom for our hem. So this total length, which is also what we're going to cut our fabric at, is going to be 25 inches. I like to make a pattern so that I don't have to do this math over and over again if I want to make multiple skirts. So I am going to draw out what my pattern is going to look like before I actually cut it. So we know the length is going to be 25 inches, okay? We are also going to place this edge on the fold over here so that our pattern is a little smaller and it's easier to cut also. So now we need this measurement across here, which is your hip measurement. Now, normally what you would do is you would add an inch for seam allowance. We're only going to sew one seam, and it's going to be right here on this edge because this one is on the fold. Normally what you would do is you would add an inch for seam allowance. Because you're going to sew a seam, you're going to lose a little bit. But this is a knit fabric, and we would like to do what's called negative ease. When I cut this 37 inches, I'm going to sew it, and it's actually going to be 36 inches instead. So it's going to stretch across the hips, and it'll make your shape pop out a little bit nicer. So we are going to cut this measurement in half across the top, and this is going to be 18.5. So now we have our pattern all laid out, and we know the numbers. So now you can create the actual pattern, and I have my pattern already done. Now, this paper that I'm using here is just simple doctor's office paper that they roll over the bench before you hop up there. And it's easy to find on the internet, and it's pretty cheap to buy a whole case of them. So that's what I've done my measurements out of. And you can see that I'm going to place this on the fold here. I have my 18.5 inches across the top, which is going to be my hip measurement, even though it's going to sit at my waist. And then it's going to be 25 inches long. So I'm going to lay this out over my fabric. And I have my fabric already put together with the right sides together so that after I cut, it'll be easier to pin and sew. So I'm just going to straighten it out a little bit here. And you'll find that working with knits is a little bit shifty. So we're just going to slide it off the end of the table. There we go. That looks pretty nice. Now I have my fold here. So I'm going to put this on top, and I'm going to line this up right on the end of the fold. And you need about a yard of fabric. Now in my case, I might need a little less here, but once you make your pattern, then you can measure it, and then you can find out exactly how much yardage that you need. Now, if I was doing this on plain cotton, I would just use my iron-off pen, and I would draw these lines directly on the fabric instead of making a pattern like this. But you can see how this is wrinkling, and it's very shifty, and it's nearly impossible to draw on. Trust me, I've tried. So this is why a pattern works really well. So now we're just going to cut. Now the edges are already matched up because I have cut it with the right sides together. So I'm just going to carefully remove my pattern. And now I have what basically looks like a tube. So I'm going to pin this edge. Now you'll notice if you look at my lines here, they are not very straight. It's really difficult to cut straight on this type of fabric, but we don't need to worry about it because today we're going to be using a serger, and there's a knife built right into it. So it'll chop that edge really nice and even before we sew the seam on it. So I'm just going to cut off a little scrap here of this fabric, and the first thing I want to do is test my serger and make sure that the settings are right so that it sews a nice straight line. So I'm going to use this test piece and I'm going to run it through the serger. Now, if I lay this out, you can see that this is not curving outward like this, meaning that the fabric is stretching when I'm sewing it. And it's also not gathering together like this, meaning that I'm, gathering it based on my differential. So it's a nice flat line, and I think we're good. So we can go ahead and sew our side seam. So you must remember that when you are sewing with a serger, there's a blade in here, and you always want the serger to cut a little bit of the fabric off so that you get a nice clean serge. And also please remove the pins because they get stuck in the blade. Guess how I learned that one? Okay, now we have an actual tube with a seam right here on the one side, and it looks pretty good. We'll trim off our end here. So what I would recommend that you do now is try the skirt on. If you pull it on over your hips, it should fit really nicely in the hips. It'll be really baggy in the waist, which is okay. We're going to put elastic in it to cinch that area in. But you can kind of take a look in the mirror and see how it fits. And if you want it a little tighter, you can just run another serge and cut off a little bit more to get the fit that you want. So we have our tube now. We're going to set that aside, and it's time to do the elastic. So let's talk about our measurements here again. So my waist is 29 inches, but I don't want it to sit right on my waist. I would actually like it to sit a little bit lower. It's a little more comfortable. So we are going to add 1 inch to the waist measurement just to make it a little bit bigger. So we actually have 30, okay? So it's your waist plus 1, a little bit of seam allowance there and a little bit of ease. So I have a piece of elastic here that I have cut to 30 inches, and I'm going to turn it into a tube. I'm going to overlap just about a ½ inch right here, and I'm going to grab a pin and fasten it in there without sticking myself. And now we're just going to sew a zigzag right down there so it's nice and sturdy when it stretches. It's better than a straight seam. So I've got my zigzag all set. I'm just going to tuck this right under the machine. I'm going to make sure and pull my pin out because I don't want that to get stuck under there, and I don't want to break a needle. Oops. Helps if you choose the right pedal too. Okay, so I'm going forward and I'm going backward and forward and backward, just a whole big bunch to make sure that it's nice and sturdy in there. So when you're done, we're going to pull it out. And now we have our waistband for our skirt. All right, let's trim off some of the threads here so they don't get in our way. See, I've got a nice little zigzag right in there just to be nice and sturdy. Okay, now it's time to attach the waistband to the skirt. So I would like to find the center of this skirt. So here's one edge and here's the other edge. I'm just going to mark this with a pin so that I know where the edges are. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this sideways like this, and I'm going to put the side seam and the pin that marks the other half right on top of each other. If I can get this to not roll, it's very fussy stuff to work with, so pinning is always key. All right, so I'm going to put a pin over here on this side, and then I'm going to put another one over here on this side. So now what I've done is I have broken up my skirt into 4 quadrants, okay, evenly spaced. I am going to repeat that process with my waistband. So I'm going to take the fold and I'm going to put it over here so that I know where the half mark is over on this side. And then I'm going to match the two together in the middle, and then I'm going to put a pin over here on this side to divide it up into 4 quadrants, and then again on this side. Okay, now I am going to tuck the elastic inside of the skirt. Now this seems weird, but remember that we always sew with the right sides together. So we're going to put this on the inside of the skirt so that it's facing the right side of the fabric. And then I am just going to use my pins. Now you'll notice that the top of my fabric here is rolling. Knits always roll. So what I like to do is just kind of hook that over the top of my elastic right there, just so it's out of the way and I be sure not to miss it as I'm sewing. Okay, so we're just going to go around the entire skirt and we're going to pin the elastic to the knit. Now you'll notice as you're doing it, the knit fabric is quite a bit bigger than the waistband, but the knit fabric will stretch as you're sewing it. So if I kind of pull it like this, you can see here that the skirt is quite a bit bigger. But we have a serger and it works fantastic, and we are going to sew this while stretched in order to get them to match up properly. All right. So I am going to start at one of my pins, and I'm going to start just before it because I want to be able to pull my pin out. Now you can kind of see your elastic under there. You can feel where your elastic is going to be when you're sewing, and you want to try not to cut it with the blade if possible. So now that I have it under there, I'm just going to give it a little gas to get it going. I'm going to remove my pin. Now, the foot is taking the weight of the fabric. So if I pull this way, you can see that there's some bagginess right here. I am going to pinch where the pin is, and I'm going to pull it towards me. I don't want to stretch the top fabric, I just want it to lay straight. It's only the elastic that I'm pulling. Now we have a nice straight area, and we're going to run that right through the serger. So you want to pull on where the pin is for as long as possible. Okay, that's about all the further that I can go. So I'm going to remove that pin. I'm going to find my next pin, swivel my skirt a little, and I'm going to pull it towards me until I have a nice flat surface to sew. Now you have to move your hand along with it and continue stretching at the same rate. So this takes a little bit of practice. my pin, take that out, find the next one, stretch it nice and neat. Looks pretty good. All right, last section, here's where I started. I'm gonna pull it nice and tight, let my knit roll over the edge of my elastic. There's a lot of adjusting that happens. All right, we have now attached our waistband. So this is what it looks like now. And it will be gathered along the top edge just a little bit like this. But if we turn this guy inside out, then you basically have elastic on the front, which is not very pretty. So we are going to flip this to the other side, and we're going to pin all the way around, okay? Now you only have to put your pins, I'm gonna swivel this so I can see a little better. You only have to put your pins every, I don't know, maybe 5 inches or so when you're doing this part. Let's turn it inside out so you get the full effect here. So here's my skirt. The reason being is that we're going to stretch it again when we sew it, and we're going to top stitch it with a regular machine. Now, when you are using a regular machine on a knit fabric, it's very important that you don't use a straight seam. I don't know if you've ever been in a dressing room of a department store and you pull on something stretchy and you hear a seam pop. That's never any fun. That's because they used a straight seam and nothing that would stretch. So when you're sewing with knits, we're going to use a zigzag stitch. If the stitch is coming across the fabric this way, it makes a peak like this inside of the stitch. When you stretch the fabric this way, the zigzag gives it room to fold flat so that the fabric is allowed to stretch. So that's very important when you're sewing with knits. So I am going to remove this front piece of my machine so that I have plenty of room to go underneath because I'm going to sew in a great big circle. So I'm going to start at one of my pins. I'm going to lower my foot down, okay? And again, I'm going to pull the fabric towards me so that these gathers go nice and flat. Don't stretch it so far that you're stretching the fabric, just to stretch the fabric nice and flat. And we're just going to sew all the way around. Give this a little more pressure here on the side. All right. There we go. Now that's moving. Just pull toward us nice and even. All right, once I get back to where I started, I'm going to do a little bit of a back stitch. And then I'm done with my top seam. Now it's time to do the hem. The first part of the hem we're going to do involves the serger because we'd like to finish the edge. So we're going to move this guy out of the way and bring the serger over. Now let's talk about knit fabric. If you look at the edge right here, it is rolling, and if you manage to cut a straight line, you really don't have to hem it because a knit will not fray. But I like to put a hem on the bottom of mine because it makes it look a little more professional. So I'm going to finish the edge first just by running the whole entire edge of the hem through the serger to give it a nice finish. Because we have just finished the edge of this, now it will lay nice and flat, so we can easily pin our hem. So I'm going to get out my measuring tool here because I would like to turn this up an inch. So on the inside of the fabric, I am just going to make sure that I have an inch, just like that, and then I'm going to repeat that all the way around. Now, again, if this was cotton, this is something that I would probably press first, but because the knits don't take a wrinkle very well, they also don't take a press very well. So it's better to just fold like this and get a pin using your measuring tool, unless you like to eyeball things like me, which is allowed. And we're going to repeat this process all the way around the skirt so that you have a 1-inch fold that is into the wrong side of your skirt. All right, once your hem is folded, we are going to do another top stitch very similar to what we did on the waistband, but because we would like it to lay flat, we're not going to pull it to stretch it this time. Okay, but again, your legs are going to be walking, and this is a very fitted skirt, so you want to make sure you use your zigzag around the edge so that it has room to move when you walk. So I'm going to lower my foot. This adjustment that I'm making on the side, by the way, controls how much my presser foot pushes down on the fabric. When I had it stretched earlier, I wanted to push it down quite a bit so that it would hold on to the elastic for me and I couldn't pull it back towards myself. But now I want to loosen it up a little bit because I don't want it to stretch the fabric as it goes under. I want to try to send the fabric under the foot as flat as possible. And you can see how it's just flowing through very nicely, and it isn't stretching out or folding over. once you get all the way around, you don't want to forget to backstitch. It's important. You don't want your hem coming loose while you're out at the park. Pull it out, trim all of your threads off, and now we have a very easy pencil skirt, and it will fit you extremely nice around the waist, and we have a nice little hem at the bottom. And that's all there is to it. Now, on the skirts that are on display behind me, what I like to do is I like to do 2 rows of the zigzag at the bottom, just because it looks a little more like I bought it somewhere. And then when I get compliments on it, like, that's so cute, where'd you get it? I can say I made it, and then I can go home and make 10 more.
Specialty fabrics can be tricky to stitch, but all you need to know are a couple of tips, and it opens up a ton of new possibilities. Knit fabric isn't technically what you would call a specialty fabric, but there are some tips to working with it that'll make things a lot easier. And knit fabric is so great for stitching garments, you definitely don't want to miss out. So the first tip for working with knit fabric is to use a ballpoint needle, which comes in different sizes. And the point on the needle is just a little bit rounded so that instead of piercing the fibers, it just sort of nestles between them, which helps the seams keep their integrity in the long run. And when you're cutting out your knit fabric pieces, you definitely want to make sure, if you're stitching a garment, that the stretch goes around your body. And when you're stitching the seams that go around your body, you want to use a zigzag stitch instead of a straight stitch, because the zigzag stitch has a little bit of stretch to it and it'll move with the stretch of the fabric. So you can see how that has a little bit of give and will stretch along with the fabric. So everything else with working with knit fabric is super easy. The edges don't ravel, so you don't really even have to hem them, which is great for quick and easy garments. Next is sequin fabric, which is very scary to work with, but it doesn't have to be. There are 2 main types of sequin fabric: the type that has the sequins all stitched on one by one, and the type that has these sequin type dots glued onto the fabric. And this type is a little easier to work with. You just might want to use a titanium needle, which will keep the glue from the dots from sticking to the needle. And everything else is really easy. You can stitch through these sequins. They're very soft, so you can stitch through those. But this type with the sequins stitched on is a little bit trickier. Before you sew any seams, well, before you cut out the fabric, first of all, you definitely don't want to cut through these sequins with your good fabric scissors, because it'll dull your blades or nick them. So either use craft scissors or just try and be careful and sort of cut around the sequins. And once you've got your pieces cut out, you want to remove the sequins from your seam allowance. So I just removed the sequins from this edge here. You don't want to stitch through sequins because your needle might break or bend or dull, definitely, or you might break the sequins, which you don't want to do either. So remove the sequins from the seam allowance, and then once you've got that stitched on, if you find that you removed maybe too many sequins, you can go back and hand stitch them back on next to the seam allowance right there. And that will make stitching sequin fabric a lot easier for you. Next, I want to talk about leather, which comes in a variety of different weights and colors, real leather, faux leather, pleather, vinyl, Oilcloth, a lot of the tips for leather go for oilcloth as well, or laminated cotton, anything that has that sort of sticky, shiny surface. So when you're stitching leather, a leather needle will come in very handy. It's made specifically for leather, and it'll just make your life easier. And leather doesn't have a grain line, so you can cut it any direction you want. And when you are preparing your leather to stitch, pins and needles will make permanent holes in the leather. So you want to pin in the seam allowance, or you can hold your layers together with binder clips or paper clips, anything like that that doesn't pierce the fabric. And when you're stitching with some types of these fabrics, you might find that this shiny, sticky surface sticks to the underside of the foot and doesn't want to feed through very well. So you can purchase a PTFE foot or a Teflon foot. They're the same foot that goes by a couple different names, which just has a non-stick surface on the foot underside, which helps feed these sticky fabrics through. Or you can put a piece of matte Scotch tape on the underside of the foot, which will also help those fabrics slide through easier. And if you find that the fabric is getting stuck on the bed of the machine, you can put another piece of fabric over it. So like I said, the same sort of tips go for leather, oilcloth, vinyl, and fabrics like that. Next up, we have open weave fabrics, which is fabrics like lace, netting, tulle, even some open weave knits, crocheted fabric, things that have wide gaps between the fibers in the weave. So when stitching these fabrics, you might also want to use a zigzag stitch for these, which just helps catch all of those open areas instead of just a regular straight stitch. And you can use a narrow zigzag stitch for your seams so that they'll still be able to be pressed open. And when stitching open weave fabrics, using French seams can be very helpful. French seams are a great way to conceal raw edges without having them be seen through this sheer fabric. So to stitch French seams, you want to stitch, if you're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I'm going to change back to a straight stitch. You want to put your fabric with wrong sides together first, which can be a little confusing, and especially with these netting and lace, the right and wrong sides might not look too much different. So you want to make a note to yourself which is the right and the wrong side, and put wrong sides together first when stitching French seams, and stitch at a scant 1/4 inch. I'll just go halfway down to show. And then turn the fabric. Now we've got right sides together. So if this is the wrong side of the fabric, we're going to stitch the seam again using a 1/4 inch. So you want to stitch the first seam at a scant 1/4 so that when you turn it and stitch at a 1/4 again, you make sure to encase all of those raw edges. And there's our seam. So our raw edges are encased, and if you see the seam through the right side of the fabric, it looks nice and pretty and enclosed. And the same thing goes for sheer fabrics like chiffon and organza, so that your seams are nice and pretty and encased. And when you're stitching with chiffon and organza, silk pins come in handy as well. So silk pins are just a little sharper and a little bit smaller than regular pins so that they would go through the chiffon or organza without snagging them. And when you stitch these open weave fabrics, if the weave is very open and you find that the needle is having a hard time catching the fabric to begin with, you can place a piece of tissue paper under the seam to help the feed dogs grab onto it. Just gives a little bit of stability to the fabric. And then when you're done stitching the seam, it just tears away. And this is just pattern paper, but you can use tissue paper that you use to wrap gifts and things. So that just tears away nice and cleanly. So that's open weave fabric. Next we have fur, which is really cool. It comes in a ton of different patterns and colors and pile lengths. It's great for Halloween costumes. So when you're cutting out fur fabric, you want to use the with nap layout if you're using a pattern. And if you're not, you just want to make sure all of your pattern pieces are going in the same direction, because we've got this nap, so we don't want a piece going this direction and a piece going this direction, because the light reflects differently and it'll look a lot different. When you're marking on fur fabric, you want to mark on the wrong side, because you won't be able to mark on the fur. Mark on the wrong side so that you can see it. And when you're cutting fur fabric, you don't want to cut just straight along, because you're just going to give your fur a haircut and you're going to get all these fuzzies. You want to cut through the backing fabric only. So you can try and kind of brush the fabric up and away from the backing, and just snip through that way. So that the cut edge of your piece has the fur all intact and not sheared off. And when you're sewing seams on your fur fabric, it can get a little bit bulky, so you might want to use a heavier weight needle and stitch slowly. And when you're done stitching your seam, you can just sort of brush all that fur out of the stitching. And it really helps to conceal that seam. There you have it. All you need are a couple of stitching tips for these specialty fabrics, and it opens up all of these great possibilities.
I'm going to show you how to make your own bias binding. Now you can certainly buy pre-made bias binding, or bias tape as it's commonly referred to, at your regular fabric store. And it comes in packages like this in different widths, and it'll be double fold, single fold, whatever your project requires. But I find typically that there's only a certain number of colors of this pre-made bias tape. And also just the feel of the fabric isn't as nice as probably what you're using on your project. So I'm really a fan of making my own, and you can really kind of streamline the process and make it so it's not as time consuming as sewing all of these strips together to make enough binding for what you need for, let's say, a king size quilt. So, also I should say that there are certain companies that do make pre-made bias binding in different, fabric prints. And you can certainly seek that out online, but often that's still not going to match your project perfectly. So if you're really looking for something totally custom, then you want to make your own. So how do we find out the yardage that we need to make our own bias binding? It is kind of a little dependent on some math. So what you're going to end up with essentially is a square of fabric that you're going to cut to make all of your strips. So you might think, okay, if I have a 45 by 60 quilt, maybe I need 2 yards of binding. Well, actually, all you need is a 26-inch square. So how you determine that is you're going to figure out the perimeter of your quilt, your placemat, whatever it is that you're binding. So let's say we are working with a 45 by 60 quilt. You would add your 45, your 60, your 45, and your 60, and you would come up with 210. And then I always give myself 15 extra inches, whether I'm making a small placemat, a huge quilt, whatever, I just add 15 to it to account for seam allowances when I'm piecing all of the strips and to account for a little extra room that I might need when mitering the corners. So 210 plus 215 will be 225. And then you want to multiply that by the desired cut width of your strips. And I like to work with 3-inch wide binding. A lot of people think that's a really wide binding to use, but I like to double it up. And it just kind of reinforces the edges of your quilt or whatever it is. And it's just how I learned. So I would multiply that by 3 and then come up with 675. Okay, now we're going to take the square root of 675, which is 25.98, and we'll round that up to 26, and that's how we get a 26-inch square. So really, you only need, a 3/4 of a yard of fabric, which actually is 27 inches, and you can cut that down to 26, or you can just start with a 27-inch square and go from there. And that'll be enough for, like I said, a 45 by 60 quilt. So once you have your square cut out, there are a couple of different methods you can choose to use to cut out all of your strips efficiently. And the first one I'm going to show you is you want to fold your lower corner up to your upper corner, match everything up nicely. And then you're going to fold this edge over like this. Okay. Now this is for bias binding, and I really like working with the bias because, it gives it a little bit of stretch, and you can go around corners really nicely. You can bind a curved edge, no problem. So I just always use bias binding. You can, depending on your project, you can use straight up grain binding, but this method is for bias. Okay, so we have our nice little triangle here. And now we're going to mark it for cutting, or you can just go ahead and cut without the marking. So since this edge is on the fold, I'm going to start with a 1.5 inch strip and cut it. Okay, so we have our first strip, and now we're going to cut 3-inch wide strips across the rest of the triangle. You can see you get a ton of strips just out of that little square. Okay, so then you have all your strips ready for piecing together. And when you're piecing together your strips, the one thing you want to make sure is that you're not lining them up how they match like this, because clearly that's just going to create a little mitered corner. What you want to do is match them up like this, so that when you fold it open, it's one long continuous strip. You also want to make sure to leave yourself a seam allowance. So you'll have these little corners poking out. If you don't have those corners poking out, when you go to open it up, you'll have to trim it off and it won't match, see? So you want to adjust, make sure you have your little corners, and take it over the machine and sew it. And you can position your needle right along that corner point and go from one edge to the other. Okay, then you have your strip, and you would clip off that little corner. Press that open, nice and flat. Cut off your other little corner. And you just keep going, piecing together all of this, and then you have enough for your 45 by 60 quilt. Awesome. Now there's another way of doing this where you will actually not need to piece together any of these strips. So it's even more of a time saver. You're going to start with your 26-inch or whatever inch square that you've come up with, and you're going to fold it again, lining your little corners. Okay. The only reason I'm folding this is so that I can cut down the center here. You could certainly use a rotary cutter for more accuracy. Or press that and create a fold line and then cut down the fold line. Okay, and now I just unfold it so that I can make sure. I'm going to match this lower edge with the upper edge and sew across. Just using like a 3/8 seam allowance here. Edge of the presser foot really is my guide. Lining it up as I go so I don't have to pin it. Okay, so now we have this really odd shaped looking thing, and we're going to draw some lines on here to indicate our 3-inch strips. So I'm going to start at one point, just go down the entire length, and I'm using a permanent marker here, but clearly you would either want to draw on the fabric wrong side or use a removable fabric marker. You also want to press open this seam so it's nice and flat for you moving forward. Okay, and then we do our next 3-inch line. It may seem a little bit tedious to do it this way, but it does save you sewing time in the end.